Started Finhaven, a first kind of business in this area, and then more recently has been working with Brooklyn Zelenka, who spoke about these return codes yesterday, and they are now fission. Both Boris and Brooke also spent a year or so volunteering into the Ethereum ecosystem, and specifically with the Ethereum Magicians, which Greg Colvin co-founded with Jamie Pitt, and then Boris facilitated the Berlin Council of Berlin.
A bunch of different things.
Various events through this year. So anyway, they have deep insight into the joys and misfunctions and the delights, upsides and downsides of the Ethereum ecosystem, and are now really focusing primarily on IPFS.
Awesome.
But Boris is going to talk about some themes, perhaps a little similar to some we had yesterday, about how do you make open source sustainable? How do you make this thing work? How do you preserve that community focus while getting people paid?
Awesome.
Okay.
Good morning. So, great info from Bob. I'm going to give you a little bit more info on my background, which I think is helpful for context. So I've been involved in open source for 15 years, basically since the very beginning of my career working in technology. I was just talking actually to David about our early experiences, putting the first Linux CD in and where that went. So 15 years ago, open source was a fight. I got up every morning and had to fight against fear, uncertainty, and doubt FUD from Microsoft. Drupal, the Drupal open source CMS is the one that I actually spent the most time in, but a large part of it was actually telling a story of open source itself and what that meant. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Yes, Bob did get me into Ethereum. He came over, spent 2 hours explaining how Ethereum was programmable. I had experimented with Bitcoin, but it was very financially focused, and I was interested in the programmability of it and the globalness of it. Basically, Bob got me super excited, as he does with many people, and I went to Coinbase, and I bought some ETH, so that I could put it in the desktop Mist client and deploy the beer coin contract. And then I sent Bob some beer coin. And I said, this is the future. And I basically have been working on it ever since in one way or another. So last year, starting with EdCon actually in May in Toronto with the Wallet Unconference, I got involved with the Ethereum Magicians. Fun story, I got involved with the Ethereum Magicians because Bob said, oh yeah, go to Reddit. But I couldn't comment on Reddit, and I couldn't post on Reddit, so I just left. And Ethereum Magicians, I could sign up and just start posting. So that was amazing. Now what we're doing with Fission is we're building decentralized Firebase with user-controlled data. So we're building a business, a company, that still is in tune with our principles of open source and ideology, and trying to make a good business that, however, still does things in a way that we agree with. So what does open source mean? So the problem is that everyone means something different when they use that term. For some people, it just means licensing. Some people think of a particular community and how they operate, their set of practices, as being, oh, that's open source. And some people think it's kind of maybe democracy and mob rule or something. So I actually got to this from a definition of what of blockchain, and I kind of reverse engineered it with open source. So the first thing that open source is, it is a legal innovation. A couple of the different open source licenses happened. I'll post the link later. Eric Raymond had to quickly come up with the MIT license because the copyright laws changed in 1976. And it meant that MIT and all of the programmers, so specifically all of the programmers who'd been working on Lisp, had been doing what we would think of as open source. They had been collaborating and sharing code and not worrying that, David wrote this line and Afri wrote this other line. They were just working on code together, which was uncommon at the time. And because copyright law changed, it now meant that instead of things being public domain unless you asserted copyright, things were automatically copyrighted. And because they all worked for the university, it meant the university owned it. And the university said, well, oh great, we've got all of this Lisp code that we can sell and commercialize. And Eric Raymond realized that they would lose all of the hard work that this group of engineers had put together, and that Lisp and programming languages would be set back decades. And so he very quickly created the MIT to lock it open. That's literally line one that I've just described. But that's the kind of history that we actually have to remember unless we'd like to repeat some of the same challenges. The stuff about open source, many people know me mainly as a hand waver. I do have a computer science degree, and I do a little bits and pieces of code in GitHub, but I usually get paid to try and help people work together in different ways. And this collaborative, asynchronous, remote way of working has become to be known as open source. And finally, open source is, of course, an ideology. You are waking up and taking a political act every single time when you decide on code reuse and sharing. I think it's kind of important for the future of humanity, so it's one of the reasons I work on it in those sorts of licenses. My friend Ted Leung is way back in 2005. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been realizing that I am going to be an old man of the internet because we can't lose touch with some of our history. We need to know these things. What we are actually doing is commons-based peer production. Lots of people work on it, everybody benefits from it, and then people can build on it. Even in a revenue-generating fashion. People often conflate open source with no money, but that's not quite the case. But we say open source because it's a little bit shorter than commons-based peer production. Free. So some of the classic phrases in the history of open source are free as in speech, meaning a particular license or ideology that gives you certain rights and freedoms, not necessarily free as in beer, no cost. The phrase that I like to share is that open source is free as in puppies, meaning that someone can give you a free puppy that is not house trained, that will chew up your slippers, and generally cause havoc by you adopting it. I think we can all think of chunks of open source code that might be thought of as puppies. So that lets us start thinking that care, attention, feeding, training, work is needed if we want open source code to thrive. And it was an excuse to put a puppy in my talk. It's 2019, and for the first time in 15 years, we're starting to see licensing innovation again. So a couple of different pieces around this. So cloud providers making record profits by hosting open source code on one side, the big bad cloud providers, versus open source companies that are funded by venture capitalists for tens of millions of dollars. both teams seem kind of awkward. It's not that simple. There's a bunch of writing about this recently. Changes to licenses by MongoDB, Elasticsearch, and others are what's precipitating this. And as end users, as developers who are trying to put systems together, we need to understand what's happening here, because licenses are in fact a technology as well. Remember, everything that we have today is actually built on the innovation of that. So we have to understand it and put some more time into it again. I've found that knowledge and awareness of open source licenses has kind of gone away in the last 15 years, because in some ways we won. I mean, won in the sense that Microsoft is one of the largest open companies in the world, one of the largest contributors to the Linux kernel. Oh yeah, and they bought GitHub, this super centralized thing with awkward permissions at the repo level that doesn't really lend itself to decentralization. What's your favorite license? Does anyone shout out a license? Apache 2 from Bob, thank you. Anyone else? MIT. GPL, which version? 3, okay. So, fun facts. Can anyone tell me the trade-offs of GPL 2 versus GPL 3? It's okay, it's not a lecture course. You should probably know this. I'll give you an example. Fun fact, newest version of macOS, macOS Catalina. The default terminal shell is moving from Bash to Z shell because of licensing. The very old version of Bash that Apple ships is licensed under GPL v2. Apple, as a corporation, is still super nervous about using GPL3 license code in any of their stuff. And so they haven't upgraded Bash because of that, because newer versions of Bash are licensed under GPL v3. Z shell, I had to look it up. Even better, it's licensed under an MIT-like license, because in part some of the shell functions are also GPL, and it's kind of pre-MIT, so this is complicated. Keep watching this space. Licensing innovation is happening. Yes, you should be tracking it. The other thing that's happening is we're starting to see people care about data, their data. What it even means to own their data. So if we start using words like data ethics, what requires software developers or companies to act in certain ways with data? We don't believe in Google's "don't be evil" anymore. Blockstack famously uses the phrase "can't be evil." And again, there's a number of different things. None of these changes happen just because of licenses. They happen in part because of societal changes. So there are a couple of things that are happening that I'm excited about, but they're just starting. I think we should keep track of them and we should think about them. So there's a couple of folks that have written about principles when writing software. The Fair Data Society, I actually was just talking to them today. They've released some of their early specifications, but I really think of them mainly as principles. Their phrase is, resistance is not futile. I think we have to remember that. The team at Ink and Switch, which are a really amazing product research team, spent 6 or 9 months compiling their thoughts and came up with some principles of what it would mean to build local first software. So instead of step 1 being a SaaS website, what if you could run stuff in a browser that all operated locally? And that if the internet connection went down or your service provider went away, your software kept functioning. So we haven't thought of these as requirements as software developers, so we just build it all centrally because that's easier. There are new licenses happening. The cryptographic autonomy license that has baked in various things around control of keys and how software has to be built in such a way so that you can get access to data in a way that actually gives those rights to you as a user of that software. Kyle Mitchell, a friend of mine, he's a dual-class lawyer engineer in Oakland. And he came up with the icepick license. And I've got all these links to these things in my, where I've got the presentation up. He calls icepick a weapon of mass user protection. That sounds pretty awesome. Oh, right, I'm supposed to talk about blockchains and Web3 and stuff. So, as most of my talks do, what I'm trying to do is hack your brain, do some mimetic warfare, and maybe get you to start thinking about this stuff. So as builders and users of blockchains and Web3, how do we need to think about open source? What can we learn from open source? What challenges does open source have that might find solutions in new blockchain and Web3 tools? Right? It is the first time, and what got me excited was, there's this third-party global system that I can now know everyone has access to, so there's certain things that we can agree on, never mind incentive layers. So why should we, as builders and users, care about open source and its evolution? And how should we get involved should be really the other part of this. So I initially was going to go through this in more detail. I've written a long blog post about this. I personally use the phrase Ethereum stack when I mean the wide set of standards and middleware and many other things that all interoperate together. I actually did some work on the initial version with Pedro and Ligi. If you go to chainid.network, it's a way where people can register the chain ID and network ID of the public network that they're running. And it's about 40, 45, including testnets. So I propose to you that this is the stack, the governance stack, and that open source is in fact the foundational layer. So each project, really as Bob has said, and as some of the explanation has happened around repos, each project, each chunk of code is going to decide how they run their individual project. The classic open source way is benevolent dictatorship. That's totally fine at the open source code layer. Then we have to come together and work on protocol standards so that chunk of open source code A, and client B will actually work together. We have a core dev process of some collaboration and some coordination so that you get releases that have similar changes at the same time. Network governance is the layer where the community gets to weigh in and kind of decide and make their voice known. And then mainnet, whatever that means broadly. All mainnets. Ultimately, the standard of blockchain is miners and others choosing to decide which client, which version, which feature flags turned on they're actually going to run. That is the layer for active systems. But it's built on top of who has decided to accept which changes into open source, what license that client code is at, and what the rules are of you being able to fork it and run your own version. It's a lot to keep in mind. Blockchains wouldn't exist without open source. We haven't actually talked a lot about dApp devs because we're kind of at a lower core layer here. But if you're building a dApp on top of the Ethereum stack, I am saying that you need to care about the layers of the stack. Get involved to make sure your dApp will succeed. Oh, I'm too busy. I've got my other thing. I've got this other layer. I did an ICO and I chose Ethereum or Ethereum Classic or whatever, but now I'm going to do a side chain. I'm like, cool. Why don't you go fuck yourself? If you're not contributing code, community, or cash, you should go build on AWS. Right? So, my friend Dries Buytaert, so he's the founder of the Drupal project. It's 18, 19 years old now. So he's one of the few people on the planet that has had the job of being the benevolent dictator of a large open source project for a very long time. He wrote a really, really great post. I think it just came out last week or the week before. Balancing makers and takers to scale and sustain open source. Super long, tons of reading. He comes from an academic background, so he went back and looked at a bunch of source material. I'm a random ham waver, so I just grab other people's blog posts. What's the formula for incenting more makers? Don't know. Like, we're in the midst of figuring this out. We don't need to punish takers, but we do need to celebrate and potentially reward makers. We have to. From Dries's post, this is some academic reading that was a great summary for me. Common goods and public goods are the ones that you can't really exclude people from. Public goods, imagine if there was a lighthouse out here. We can all benefit from the light. And it doesn't, you know, if Yaz uses the lighthouse, it doesn't harm my access of that lighthouse. Common goods are things where, in fact, they are rivalrous. So if I catch some fish, then other people are not catching fish. In the blockchain systems that we're talking about, the open source layer of the clients, the middleware, the wallets, and so much of our blockchain ecosystems are public goods. More people consuming the bits of the clients doesn't cost anything. There's an asterisk there because support and onboarding, going back to the free puppies, does cost real resources. Filling blocks with transactions and state bloat are common goods. So if one person's filling them up, then another person can't. So we're in a system where we're dealing with both public and common goods. And that's a framework that we need to keep looking at and figuring out how to solve it. Sustainability. Second F-bomb. Fuck that phrase. Faraz, who's a maintainer of a number of large JavaScript libraries, recently ran some experiments. And he said, sustainability is another way to say subsistence. This is why the common phrase open source sustainability isn't ideal. We should set our goals higher than subsistence. Folks who work on open source have a right to thrive and to be fairly compensated for our labor. Even though our ideology and our licensing says, you don't have to pay us. It is free as in giving you a free beer. But I might stop brewing beer unless you let me thrive. A new deal. People in the blockchain space know economics way better than me. Please don't beat me up about whatever the hell FDR actually came up with. This is purely for memeability. I submit to you, open source is a key enabler and foundation for blockchains in Web3. Every day, including meeting in this room, we are practicing commons-based peer production while building and operating global public blockchains. Figuring out a new deal for open source is crucial if we expect to keep our systems running for decades. I would like to see a thriving Ethereum stack. Millions of lines of open source code plus standards that guide interoperability, and it's much bigger than any single mainnet chain or market cap. Let's continue the momentum of the Ethereum stack community and solve creating the conditions for thriving open source contributors. And that's how we stay alive for decades. What we're doing at Fission is trying to build, rather than a cloud provider, a constellation provider built on open source. We're building a decentralized Firebase, a backend as a service that can run directly from your laptop and gives developers the tools to keep data user controlled. I'm creating this commercial company to try and solve this problem and include users and competitors and all users of these protocols. And I hope that we can all work together on this Ethereum stack to solve it for everyone. Thank you. Do you want me to take questions, or shall I leap off stage?
So in your experience, what is the risk of regulatory, or not regulatory, but just capture from patents and things like that? What should we look at?
Thank you. So the question was, what is the risk of regulatory capture from things like patents in open source? I chose not to cover this, but it's a great question, and thank you. So patents are a whole other layer. It's unfortunately the layer that countries use to keep track of who's winning in this phrase innovation. I believe many of us are likely against software patents. And there's still stuff going through the courts, like the whole Oracle Java versus Google that has me super afraid. Like, literally, those are meta conditions. Apache 2, if you're choosing licenses, Apache 2 includes patent rules that basically mean that if someone contributes code that is an implementation of a patent that they hold, and they start suing people who use that open source software, they themselves lose the rights to use the software. So one super simplistic way of thinking about it, I am not a lawyer, is that Apache 2 gives us some help with that. I have an issue open in the Ethereum improvement proposal repo saying that never mind code, the standards process. Someone could propose a standard, which the text of the standard is available under public domain, but they don't have to disclose that it's covered by patents. And then we all run around like idiots and implement it with GPL, with Apache, with MIT, in our clients, and then that person go, I've got a patent, and we're screwed. So we need to fix it.
And I can think of a very specific instance where that is a risk.
So, yes. Any other questions?
Okay. I guess me first. So you said IcePick protects users. How does IcePick protect users compared to regular open source licenses?
So it includes users, and it's more around the data. I won't fully paraphrase it, but the intent of some of these things is that as a user, if you're using a piece of software, it's not just that you can use that actual code, but even things like, oh, if you need to move from one provider to another provider, there's no barriers for you to doing that. There's no things like a proprietary data format, right? So that we start looking at just code that's open source and realize there's a bunch more layers. And IcePick, literally in the agreement that you make with the person providing software to you, gives you as the user additional rights, locking open your data and your ability to use it, move it, run it yourself, ask someone else to run it for you. You can't ask someone else to run a copy of Facebook. And this is one of the things that it would do, is say, you must, as a provider, allow this.
So is IcePick then more about licensing data than it is about licensing code? Or licensing rights to data?
If running a piece of software requires, as a step one, running all of Google, it's going to be pretty hard to be portable. It doesn't really matter if the code is open source. So it just looks at all of those layers and says you must be able to have someone else run it for you. And I think these things are very blurry, and I think that data ends up being more valuable in the code, especially when what we end up doing is having agreement on standards, because anybody could re-implement the code. So the next hole is, as well as being able to re-implement the code of standards, locking the data open.
Boris, what do you think about how do you protect maintainers of a code base from, like, let's say, anonymous contributor? I mean, obviously you want anonymous contribution, you want to welcome that kind of environment, but how do you have like a maybe like a middle ground between anonymity and signing a CLA, let's say?
What you're starting to ask me is which ideology I should select for you. There are many people who believe, they're like, don't care, it's open, it's available, no one's going to ever come sue me. I'm contributing this under the viral GPL3 because it aligns with my ideology. Depending on the goals of your organization and what you need to be careful of, I'd say the other extreme of it in some ways is we make sure to sign a contributor license agreement, not about anonymous or not. I'm less worried about the anonymous piece, but rather about the piece of that the project as a whole has the ability to relicense when it needs. So also in Dries' blog post is actually an amazing thing, is if you reserve the right to relicense a project, it means that someone in the future can come up with a new license that you can upgrade to. Do we think that open source licenses built in the 70s and 80s are the best licenses we're ever going to have? So CLAs gives you an option. Without the CLA, you're screwed.
But also lets you close it later. Like if I license out of patch and everybody's CLA it, then I can just close it off.
Who is the you? I think that's the tricky part there. So, no, it's more complicated than that. So one of the things that you always have is you always have the right to fork. Always. And fork as in code. So you can take that code that's been CLA'd, and it's been CLA'd so that all of the rights are in an organization. I'm very excited of saying, so right now it tends to be relatively unfair. There's one organization or one business entity that holds the exclusive rights to CLA and no one has it. Maybe a foundation owns it. Slightly better, but foundations can still be captured as well, and it's not equal. If you're not foundation, then you don't have the same rights. What if those rights were owned by a DAO, where all of the contributors had a piece of it? That starts to get interesting, and that's exactly what I mean, where for the first time we actually have new tools that we can do interesting things. At worst, you can fork, you have an Apache 2 copy, but you can't refork because the CLA doesn't lie with you, it lies with there. Does that make sense and is fair? Yeah, but you're like, this is exactly what, like if we're not thinking about this, then we're suckers providing free labor, right? Please.
Thanks, Boris. It's a very thought-provoking talk this morning. I have lots of questions, but I'll limit myself to just one. Do you think the new regulatory landscape that's coming, that was rolled out with the GDPR out in Europe, and the one that's coming out in California and New York next year, and I'm pretty sure in the next 5 years, every province in Canada will have something which protects consumer privacy. Is this along the same lines of what you're talking about? Because I think I missed that point in your talk. What is the effect of governments stepping in and trying to protect the little guy?
Classically, regulation and regulation overhead actually mainly protects entrenched players. And I think that's what we're already seeing. So I'm super nervous about Facebook being like, yeah, totally regulate us, because then the chances of us ever building another Facebook become lower. Yes, there are a bunch of these coming on, and because it is at the societal level, it means it's at the political level and so on. I know of a number of projects that, technical frameworks, that one of their things that they're promoting is that the way that they store data and give access to users and do end-to-end encryption is that it's automatically GDPR compliant, because we don't have centralized databases and a bunch of other things like this. Our own software at Fission, I hope to get in that same direction as well, where we can give easy developer tools so developers can choose to build new apps that are automatically user privacy preserving. I think that as a set of open source voices, we need to get involved in those discussions and in those regulations to have our point of view heard, which is a little different than the centralized corporations. So yes, the discussion around this is only going to heat up. And a lot of the things that we've already learned and trained at around encryption and private keys and various things like that are going to become very useful. And we need to make sure, I mean, the recent news where, you know, regulators are saying like, oh, Facebook, we want backdoors and end-to-end encryption. We're on Facebook's side in this case. We need to make sure that they reserve the right for no backdoor encryption. Can I get a hallelujah? Woo! Thank you.
The same question happened to the China and US trading too.
I don't know enough about the situation in China. I believe that those of us lucky enough to live in Vancouver, need to spend more time elsewhere learning more of that. I've spent a little bit of time in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and I think even more so, I want to make sure that these tools work in other countries. The big thing that came out of China was a new open source license that pushed back against 24/7 work, right? And a lot of the things around blockchains are about making sure that we can remain private in the face of nation-state actors. I don't know enough to see how we can succeed at that with China, but we have to try. As the Fair Data Society says, resistance is not futile. That's not really an answer, but it's saying absolutely, and we need your voices to participate in this community to say what will work for you in China to allow you to continue to operate.
Last 2 years, China went crazy by the Bitcoin.
Right? These are all current topics that we have to focus on.
I have a question from YouTube. When should you consider developing your own license?
Oh God, never.
Never.
The question, I'll just repeat it to make sure it's said loudly. When should you consider developing your own license? The short answer is never, just in the same way that you shouldn't develop your own crypto. Think of licenses and law as a tool, as a very high weapons-grade technology. You want to have really smart legal teams on your side and work together. We are seeing new ones like the cryptographic autonomy license and so on. I'd like to see us more work together and say, here's what I'm trying to solve, and I think the existing set of open source licenses don't cut it. Right now, there's a bunch of bottoms-up work in the open source community to actually add an ethical use clause to open source licenses. This makes a lot of people super nervous because who gets to decide what the ethics are? And that has the potential to lock down open source usage. If it means that my software isn't used to help efficiently run concentration camps holding children on the US border, I would sign that license. So that's what we should work together on.
I have another question. All right. Another question from YouTube. Wouldn't a government have to actually recognize a DAO licensing system? And how do you enforce it outside the code?
I mean, I think this is the interesting thing is a DAO kind of like an upgraded co-op structure? Is it an LLC? I know some people locally who are working on making legal DAOs where they have a DAO-like structure that's on-chain, but then they plug it into a US-based LLC. So that exactly thing is the question mark. So one version, and I see a lot of activists going, we will go completely against the government and we don't care about laws and we'll use open source software. The other extreme is start trying to change from the inside.
And something that I've seen along that line, which really talks to you need top lawyers to do this, is we met Aaron Wright at Berlin, who is heading the Open Law Project, and he's he's a professor at a law university. He's knows what he's doing.
No slouch.
He is no slouch.
Yeah.
But he is working on this project within consensus. So he proposed there a legally enforceable DAO kind of concept. You have multiple sort of legal tech projects that are looking at that question of how you marry on-chain things with existing legal things. How do you get those two together? And the general pattern sort of seems to be this sort of digital twin kind of pattern, of which I guess is like Ricardian contracts, of saying, here is code, and the code has got a corresponding real-world legal agreement, and the two are kind of referring to each other, so that you're sort of doing a real-world adapter connector that's saying, I do a real-world legal signature thing that points to the DAO and says, I approve of this. We are blessing this within the legal system. And that's the piece that's been missing on that anarchistic side of assuming, well, you can't get us. There's nothing that you can do. So Stephen Pally wrote an article in 2016, which was the very first encounter I had with him for CoinDesk, which was called How to Sue a DAO. And he was basically, working through different ways that he thought legal action could be taken against the DAO, which was happening at that time. Because there's lots of real-world people who you can identify. Curators, people who built it, exchanges who trade in it. And it's these junction points with the real world where you can legally enforce. I mean, it's really exchanges that have been copying it the most, but others who are there, oh, you wrote the code, did you? Oh, you seemingly launched it. Well, guess what? That was an illegal security, and you're going to court.
One of the most worrying things is a discussion by a lot of legal theorists on open source software developers having to have fiduciary duties, which I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. But to your point, I think that's exactly it. Like, you've instantly thought, but wait, I don't get the additional rights of that CLA, right? So how do we write down what you want? And it turns out my friend Kyle Mitchell took a crack at this, which is basically a CLA that says not only are you signing it and says this particular repo and this owner, but if anyone forks it, everyone agrees to transfer that from that point in time as well. So everybody ends up continuing to have the right to relicense and upgrade the software from those points in time, right? But you're going to need a brain like Stephen Pally, Aaron Wright, or Kyle Mitchell to figure out both the software needs and figure out the legal. So just like anything else, as a user of licenses, as developers, or as business people, define what you need, your requirements, and the lawyers can help you figure this out. Which may sound weird, like I don't pretend that I know the ins and outs of this at all, and I shouldn't because I'm not a trained lawyer in the same way that a non-developer is not going to be able to come up with stuff. Does YouTube have more questions? Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, maple syrup power. Thank you.
So thanks very much. That was fantastic, Boris.